The heavy oak doors of the Riverside Country Club swung open as Robert Whitmore adjusted his gold cufflinks. At 65, he owned half the city's skyline and commanded respect wherever he walked. His real estate empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state, and he never let anyone forget it. The marble floors echoed with his confident footsteps as fellow club members nodded in acknowledgement. This was his world, and everything in it followed his rules. Robert had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single apartment building 40 years ago. Now his company owned shopping centers, office towers, and luxury developments across 3 states. He lived in a mansion overlooking the river, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, and belonged to exclusive circles where handshakes sealed million-dollar deals. Success had taught him that money could solve any problem and buy any solution. His pride and joy was his daughter, 28-year-old Grace. She had everything he could provide: the best education at private schools, a marketing degree from an Ivy League university, and a promising career at a top advertising firm. Grace was intelligent, beautiful, and successful in her own right. She lived in a penthouse apartment he had bought for her, and drove a luxury car he had gifted on her birthday. In Robert's mind, she deserved nothing but the finest things in life, including the right kind of husband. Grace had always been independent, sometimes frustratingly so. She had insisted on earning her own way in business rather than joining his company. While Robert admired her determination, he expected her to make choices that reflected well on the family name. Marriage was one area where he felt his opinion mattered most. After all, hadn't he provided her with everything? Didn't she owe him this much consideration? The phone call came on a Tuesday evening as Robert reviewed contracts in his home office. Grace's voice bubbled with excitement as she announced she was bringing someone special to Sunday dinner. "Dad, I've been seeing someone wonderful for 3 months now. I really want you to meet him. His name is David Thompson, and he's a doctor." Robert smiled, immediately picturing the kind of man his daughter would choose. Probably from a good family, likely someone he'd met at the country club or through mutual connections. A doctor sounded perfect: respectable, wealthy, educated. He began planning how he might help the young man's career, perhaps introducing him to influential friends who could open doors. Sunday arrived with crisp autumn weather. Robert's wife Helen had prepared an elaborate meal, using their finest china and crystal. The dining room looked impressive with fresh flowers and polished silver. Robert wore his best suit and waited in the living room, rehearsing the conversation he planned to have with this promising young doctor. When the doorbell rang, Robert walked to the foyer with a welcoming smile. Grace entered first, glowing with happiness, followed by a tall, well-dressed man who extended his hand confidently. "Mr. Whitmore, it's an honor to meet you. I'm David Thompson." The smile froze on Robert's face. The man standing before him was black, and in that instant, Robert's carefully constructed world tilted. All his plans, his assumptions, his vision of his daughter's future crumbled. He stared for a moment too long before mechanically shaking David's hand, his mind racing to process this unexpected development. David seemed genuinely pleased to meet him, speaking with articulate confidence about his work as a heart surgeon at the city's most prestigious hospital. He mentioned his medical degree, his residency, his specialization in complex cardiac procedures. The words floated past Robert as he struggled with his own shock and growing disapproval. During dinner, David proved himself to be everything Robert might have wanted in a future son-in-law, if only he had been white. The young man spoke intelligently about current events, showed genuine interest in Robert's business ventures, and treated Grace with obvious adoration and respect. He came from a family of professionals. His father was a retired teacher, his mother a nurse. He volunteered at free clinics on weekends and had published research in medical journals, but Robert couldn't see past his skin color. Years of unconscious bias, social conditioning, and the insular world of his wealthy circles had shaped his thinking. He worried about what his friends would say, what it might mean for his business relationships, how it would reflect on his family's reputation in their social circle. Helen seemed charmed by David, asking about his work and laughing at his stories. Grace beamed as she watched her parents interact with the man she clearly loved. But Robert remained distant, responding to David's attempts at conversation with cool politeness. After dinner, David excused himself to take an emergency call from the hospital. Robert immediately cornered Grace in the kitchen, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What are you thinking?" This can't be serious, Grace's face flushed. Dad, what's wrong with you? David is amazing. He's kind, intelligent, successful. He's not right for you, Robert interrupted. Think about your future, about our family's position. What will people say? What people, Dad? The only people whose opinions matter are the ones who care about our happiness. Grace's voice rose with frustration. David is one of the most respected surgeons in the city. He saves lives every day. If you can't see how wonderful he is, that's your problem, not mine. Robert's face hardened. As long as I'm supporting you, as long as you're living in my apartment and driving my car, you'll consider my feelings about who you're dating. This relationship needs to end. The argument escalated quickly. Grace stood her ground, defending David and challenging her father's prejudices. Robert couldn't understand how his accomplished daughter could be so naive about social realities. In his world, certain boundaries existed for good reasons, and crossing them led to complications and problems. When David returned from his call, the tension in the house was obvious. Grace walked him to the door, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Robert watched from his study window as they talked quietly on the front steps. David's hand gentle on Grace's shoulder as she wiped her eyes. That night, Robert lay awake thinking about the evening. He told himself he was being practical, looking out for his daughter's best interests. Society had rules, expectations. His business associates, his friends at the country club, his social circle, they all shared certain understandings about how things should be. Helen tried to reason with him, praising David's character and obvious love for Grace. He's a good man, Robert. Isn't that what matters? But Robert had made up his mind. He would use every tool at his disposal, financial pressure, social influence, emotional manipulation, to end this relationship. In his experience, money and power could solve any problem. He was confident that once Grace faced the reality of losing her comfortable lifestyle, she would make the sensible choice. He had built an empire by never backing down from a challenge. This situation would be no different. Robert Whitmore always got what he wanted, and what he wanted was a son-in-law who fit properly into his carefully ordered world. The confrontation Robert expected never came. Instead, Grace surprised him with quiet determination that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. 3 days after the dinner, she appeared at his office unannounced, dressed professionally and carrying herself with unusual formality. "I'm returning your credit cards," she said, placing them on his mahogany desk. "I've moved my things out of the apartment. You can have it back." Robert leaned back in his leather chair, studying his daughter's face for signs of the emotional breakdown he anticipated. Instead, he saw resolve that made his stomach tighten with unease. "Grace, don't be dramatic. We can work this out if you'll just listen to reason." "I am being reasonable, Dad. I'm choosing to be with someone who makes me happy, someone who treats me with respect and love. If you can't accept that, then I need to build a life that doesn't depend on your approval or your money." She had found a smaller apartment across town and taken a second job teaching evening marketing classes to make ends meet. The transition from luxury to modest living seemed to energize rather than discourage her. When Robert drove past her new building, he was dismayed to see her looking genuinely content as she walked to her car. Robert's initial confidence began to waver, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. If Grace wanted to be stubborn, he would show her the consequences of defying him. He began making phone calls, using his influence in ways he told himself were necessary. His first target was David's position at the hospital. Robert served on several charity boards with hospital administrators and had donated generously to their fundraising campaigns. Surely they would listen to his concerns about a doctor who was causing problems for a major benefactor's family. The call to Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of surgery, didn't go as planned. When Robert carefully suggested that David might not be the right fit for their prestigious institution, Dr. Williams's response was immediate and firm. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to stop you right there. Dr. Thompson is one of our most skilled surgeons. His patient outcomes are exceptional. His research is groundbreaking, and his colleagues respect him enormously. If this conversation is heading where I think it is, I need to tell you that any attempt to interfere with his career based on his personal relationships would be completely inappropriate." Robert tried a different approach, speaking to board members about concerns over David's judgment and character. But David's reputation was solid. Fellow doctors praised his skill. Nurses appreciated his kindness to patients, and hospital administrators valued his contributions to their cardiac program. Robert's vague complaints gained no traction. Frustrated by his lack of progress at the hospital, Robert turned his attention to Grace's career. He knew partners at the advertising firm where she worked, men who owed him favors from various business dealings. Certainly they would understand his position and help guide his daughter away from this mistake. But Grace had anticipated this move. She had already spoken honestly with her supervisor about potential conflicts of interest, explaining that her personal life might create pressure from clients connected to her father. Her honesty and proactive approach impressed her colleagues, and when Robert's subtle inquiries came, they were politely but firmly deflected. The country club became another battleground. Robert expected support from his longtime friends, men who shared his background and presumably his values. Instead, he found uncomfortable questions and unexpected challenges to his assumptions. "What's wrong with the young man?" asked Charles Peterson, a retired judge who had known Robert for 20 years. "I've heard nothing but good things about Dr. Thompson from people at the hospital." "It's not about him personally," Robert said, lowering his voice. "It's about what's appropriate, what makes sense for families like ours." Charles studied him with sharp eyes that had seen through countless excuses in his courtroom. "Robert, I've watched you build an empire through hard work and intelligence. Don't let ignorance tear down what you've accomplished with your family." The conversation left Robert shaken. He began to notice how isolated his views were becoming, even among his own social circle. Younger members of the club spoke openly about diversity and inclusion. Business partners referenced successful interracial couples they knew. The world had changed around him while he remained locked in outdated thinking. At home, Helen grew increasingly vocal in her disapproval of his campaign against David. She had met with Grace and David several times, taking care to do so when Robert was traveling. Her reports of these meetings only made him angrier. "He brought flowers for me and asked thoughtful questions about my garden," Helen told him after one visit. "He listens when Grace talks and makes her laugh. He's polite, educated, and clearly devoted to her. What more could you want in a son-in-law?" "You don't understand the complications this will create," Robert insisted. "The problems our grandchildren will face, the way people will judge our family. The only person judging our family right now is you," Helen replied sharply. "And you're doing a fine job of destroying it all by yourself." The strain began showing in Robert's business dealings. His usual focus wavered as he obsessed over his daughter's relationship. Partners noticed his distraction during important meetings. His assistant fielded increasingly frustrated calls from clients who couldn't reach him when he was out pursuing his personal campaign. Grace and David's relationship, meanwhile, seemed to strengthen under pressure. They were seen together at charity events, professional functions, and cultural activities around the city. People who met them came away impressed by their obvious compatibility and mutual respect. The breaking point came at a hospital fundraising gala that Robert had helped organize. Grace and David attended together, and Robert watched from across the room as they moved through the crowd. David was clearly in his element, discussing medical advances with colleagues and charming donors with his knowledge and passion for his work. Robert's business associate, Jennifer Martinez, approached him during the cocktail hour. "Your daughter's boyfriend is quite impressive," she said. "My husband had David as his cardiac surgeon last year. He saved Tom's life with a procedure that other doctors said was too risky to attempt." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. While he had been trying to damage David's career, the man had been saving lives, including the life of someone Robert knew and respected. The realization of his own behavior crashed over him with sickening clarity. He watched Grace and David dancing later that evening, seeing for the first time how perfectly they complemented each other. David's hand rested protectively on Grace's back, and she looked up at him with complete trust and love. They moved together with the easy comfort of two people who truly knew and appreciated each other. For the first time since this began, Robert wondered if he was the one making the mistake. The thought terrified him because it meant questioning everything he believed about himself and his judgment. He had always been the man with the answers, the one who saw situations clearly and made the right decisions. That night, he sat in his study long after Helen had gone to bed, staring out at the city lights and trying to understand how his certainty had become so shaken. His campaign to separate Grace and David had failed completely. succeeding only in alienating his daughter and isolating himself from his family. But pride is a powerful force, and Roberts had been built over decades of success and control. Instead of admitting error, he doubled down on his position. If subtle pressure wouldn't work, perhaps more direct action would. He began planning new strategies, convinced that eventually Grace would realize her mistake and thank him for his persistence. What Robert didn't know was that his actions had set in motion events that would soon force him to confront the true consequences of his prejudice in the most personal and devastating way possible. 6 months had passed since Grace moved out, and Robert's campaign against her relationship had become an exhausting obsession. The stress was taking its toll in ways he refused to acknowledge. His sleep was restless, his appetite poor, and his temper shorter than usual. Helen had started sleeping in the guest room after their arguments became too frequent and heated. The morning of March 15th started like any other day of the past several months. Robert arrived at his office by 7, determined to focus on the quarterly board meeting scheduled for that afternoon. His company was negotiating a major development deal worth $50 million, and he needed to present the proposal to investors. But even as he reviewed financial projections, his mind wandered to Grace. He had seen her the previous week at a restaurant across town, sitting with David and laughing at something he had said. She looked happy in a way that both pleased and frustrated Robert. His little girl was thriving without his support or approval, and he couldn't decide whether to feel proud or hurt by her independence. The board meeting began at 2 o'clock with 12 investors seated around the polished conference table. Robert stood at the head of the room, presenting slides about projected returns and market analysis. This was his element, commanding a room full of powerful people, steering millions of dollars in investment capital, building his empire one deal at a time. Halfway through his presentation, Robert felt a strange tightness in his chest. He paused, thinking he might have pulled a muscle during his morning workout. The sensation passed, and he continued talking about construction timelines and profit margins. But 20 minutes later, the tightness returned, accompanied by a dull ache that seemed to radiate down his left arm. "Mr. Whitmore, are you all right?" asked one of the investors, a woman who had noticed Robert's increasingly pale complexion. "I'm fine," Robert insisted, though sweat had begun beading on his forehead despite the air-conditioned room. "As I was saying, the projected completion date." The pain hit him like a freight train, crushing his chest and making it impossible to breathe. Robert grabbed the edge of the conference table, his vision blurring as agony shot through his torso. The last thing he remembered was the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as people rushed to help him. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but to Robert it felt like hours. Paramedics worked efficiently, checking his vital signs and starting an IV as they loaded him onto a stretcher. Through waves of pain, he heard medical terms he didn't understand: ST elevation, cardiac enzymes, emergency catheterization. The nearest hospital was City General, where David worked as a cardiac surgeon. But Robert was unconscious by the time they arrived, his body fighting to survive a massive heart attack that had damaged significant portions of his heart muscle. Helen received the call at home while tending her roses. She drove to the hospital in a daze, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her first call was to Grace, who left work immediately and arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes. The emergency room doctor, a young man named Dr. Rodriguez, explained Robert's condition with gentle professionalism. "Your husband has suffered a major heart attack. We've stabilized him for now, but he needs immediate surgery. The damage is extensive, and we're looking at a complex procedure that will require our most experienced cardiac surgeon." "Whatever he needs," Helen said immediately. "Cost is not a concern. Get the best surgeon available." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "Dr. Thompson is our top cardiac surgeon. He's in surgery now with another patient, but he should be available within the hour. His success rate with cases like this is the highest in the state." Grace went very still. "Did you say Dr. Thompson?" "David Thompson." "Yes, do you know him?" "He's exceptional. Trained at Johns Hopkins, published extensively in cardiac research. Your father will be in excellent hands." Helen looked at Grace with wide eyes, both women understanding the cruel irony of the situation. The man Robert had tried to destroy professionally might be the only person capable of saving his life. Grace found David in the surgical locker room an hour later, reviewing Robert's charts and x-rays. His face was serious as he studied the extent of the damage, mentally preparing for one of the most challenging operations of his career. "David," Grace said quietly from the doorway. He looked up, and she saw him process the connection immediately. Robert Whitmore, the man who had tried to sabotage his career and end his relationship with Grace, was now his patient. "How long have you known?" David asked. "Dr. Rodriguez just told us." "David, I know this is complicated, but—" "Grace, stop." David's voice was firm but not unkind. "Your father needs surgery and I'm the surgeon on call. That's all that matters right now. But after everything he's done to you, to us—" David moved to her, taking her hands in his. "Your father is a human being who needs help. My personal feelings don't change my responsibility as a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm and to preserve life. That oath doesn't come with exceptions for people who don't like me." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, overwhelmed by David's integrity in such a difficult moment. "I love you so much. I love you too. Now let me go save your father's life." The surgery began at 6:30 that evening. David worked with a team of specialists using techniques he had perfected over years of training and experience. The operation was complicated by the extensive damage to Robert's heart, requiring multiple bypasses and careful reconstruction of damaged tissue. Helen and Grace sat in the surgical waiting room, joined by several of Robert's business associates who had heard about his collapse. As hours passed, the waiting room emptied until only family remained. Helen held Grace's hand, both women alternating between prayer and worry. At 11:15, David emerged from the operating room, still wearing his scrubs and surgical cap. His face was exhausted but showed cautious optimism. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "Your father's condition was critical, but we were able to repair most of the damage. He's not out of danger yet. The next 48 hours will be crucial, but his chances are good." Helen stood and hugged David impulsively, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my husband." David returned the hug gently. "He's being moved to cardiac intensive care. You can see him briefly, but he'll be sedated for several hours while his body begins to heal." Grace approached David as her mother went to call family members with the news. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you put aside everything he's done and just focus on saving his life?" David was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "When I became a doctor, I learned that healing isn't about who deserves what. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who needs help. Your father is someone's husband, someone's father. He's loved by people who would be devastated to lose him. That's what I see when I'm in the operating room." They walked together toward the intensive care unit, where Robert lay surrounded by monitors and machines that tracked every beat of his damaged heart. His face was pale and peaceful in unconsciousness, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Grace had ever seen him. Helen sat beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking softly to him even though he couldn't hear. Grace watched her parents together and felt the weight of how close they had come to losing everything. Not just Robert's life, but their family's chance at redemption. David checked Robert's monitors and made notes in his chart with professional detachment. But Grace caught him watching her father's sleeping face with something that might have been compassion. And she realized that this moment would change everything for all of them. Outside the hospital, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that in one quiet room, a man's life hung in the balance, saved by the very person he had tried to destroy. The irony was profound, but more than that, it was a test of character that would reshape a family's understanding of what truly mattered. Robert's eyes opened slowly on the third day, confusion clouding his vision as he tried to understand where he was. The steady beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell told him he was in a hospital, but his last clear memory was standing in the boardroom presenting to investors. His chest ached with every breath and tubes seemed to be attached to every part of his body. "Welcome back," said a gentle voice. A nurse named Carol was adjusting his IV, her movements efficient but kind. "You gave everyone quite a scare. How are you feeling?" "What happened to me?" Robert's voice came out as a whisper, his throat raw from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "You had a major heart attack, Mr. Whitmore. You've been unconscious for 3 days, but you're stable now thanks to some excellent surgery." Helen appeared at his bedside, her eyes red from crying but bright with relief. She kissed his forehead gently, and Robert could see the fear she had been carrying. "I thought I was going to lose you," she whispered. Over the next few hours, Robert learned the details of his condition. The heart attack had been massive, requiring immediate surgery to save his life. He would need months of recovery and significant lifestyle changes. But he was alive, and the doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis. It wasn't until the afternoon that Robert learned who had performed his surgery. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of surgery, made her rounds with a team of medical students and residents. She examined Robert's incisions and reviewed his progress with professional satisfaction. "Your surgeon did exceptional work," she told Robert. "The damage to your heart was extensive, but Dr. Thompson's skill gave you the best possible outcome. You're very fortunate to have had him available." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Dr. Thompson?" "David Thompson. Yes, he's our finest cardiac surgeon. He worked for over 6 hours to repair your heart. You owe your life to his expertise." The words hit Robert like another heart attack. The man he had spent months trying to destroy had saved his life. The irony was so profound it made him feel nauseated. When the medical team left, Robert lay staring at the ceiling, trying to process the implications of what he had learned. Helen sat beside his bed, watching his face carefully. "You need to know something else," she said quietly. "David never hesitated. When he learned you were his patient, he didn't ask to be reassigned. He didn't let personal feelings interfere with his judgment. He just focused on saving your life. Why would he do that? After everything I did? Because he's a good man, Robert. That's what Grace has been trying to tell you." Grace arrived that evening after work, bringing flowers from her small garden. She looked tired but happy to see her father awake and alert. They talked carefully at first, avoiding the obvious subject that hung between them. "Dad, I know this is complicated," Grace finally said, "but I hope you'll at least consider that maybe you were wrong about David." Robert closed his eyes, feeling overwhelmed by shame and gratitude he didn't know how to express. "I need to think about a lot of things." Over the following days, Robert learned more about David's character from hospital staff who had no idea about their personal connection. The nurses spoke about his kindness to patients and families. Other doctors mentioned his willingness to take on the most difficult cases. The hospital chaplain told Robert how David often spent his own money to help families who couldn't afford necessary treatments. "Dr. Thompson saved my mother's life last year," said Maria, one of the housekeeping staff. "She didn't have good insurance, but he made sure she got the surgery she needed. He even visited her during recovery on his own time. He's an angel." Each story was like a small knife in Robert's chest, cutting away at the prejudices he had used to justify his behavior. The man he had seen as unworthy of his daughter was beloved by patients, respected by colleagues, and devoted to healing others. Meanwhile, Robert had used his wealth and influence to try to destroy an innocent person's career. The breakthrough came when David himself finally visited Robert's room. It was late evening and the hospital was quiet except for the distant sounds of medical equipment and hushed conversations. David appeared in the doorway wearing street clothes, having finished his shift. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm glad to see you're recovering well. Do you mind if I come in?" Robert nodded, not trusting his voice. David approached the bed with the same calm professionalism he showed all his patients. But Robert could see the wariness in his eyes. "I wanted to check on your progress personally and answer any questions you might have about your surgery or recovery." They talked for several minutes about medical details, the procedure, the healing process, the medications Robert would need. David was thorough and patient, explaining everything in terms Robert could understand. But underneath the medical discussion was the weight of their shared history. Finally, Robert couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you save me? After everything I did to you, why didn't you just let someone else handle my case?" David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, I became a doctor to help people. Hence, someone needs surgery. I don't ask about their politics or their personal feelings about me. I see a human being who needs help and I try to provide the best care I can. But I tried to destroy your career. I used my influence to turn people against you. I know. Grace told me what you were doing. It was hurtful and disappointing. But my oath as a physician doesn't have exceptions for people who don't like me. And honestly, I knew that if I didn't save your life, Grace would never forgive me, or herself." The simple dignity of David's response broke something inside Robert. Tears came then, the first he had shed since childhood. All his wealth, all his power, all his influence, and he had never shown the kind of character this man displayed every day. "I was wrong," Robert whispered. "I was so wrong about you, about everything." David pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand that seeing Grace with me challenged some long-held beliefs. I don't take that lightly. But I love your daughter more than my own life, and I would do anything to make her happy. That includes having a relationship with you if you're willing. How can you even consider forgiving me? Because holding on to anger would hurt Grace, and I won't do that. Because you're going to be my family if Grace and I get married, and I want us to understand each other. And because I believe people can change if they really want to." Robert looked at this man, really looked at him, and saw strength, compassion, intelligence, and integrity. He saw someone who had responded to hatred with healing, to prejudice with professionalism, to personal attacks with personal grace. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Robert said. "Maybe not," David replied honestly. "But Grace deserves to have her father at her wedding. She deserves to have her children know their grandfather. She deserves a family that's whole. That's worth forgiving a lot of mistakes." That night, Robert lay awake thinking about the man who had saved his life, and the daughter he had nearly lost through his own stubborn pride. For the first time in months, he began to see a path forward, not just for his recovery, but for his redemption. It would require admitting he had been wrong about fundamental things he had believed his entire life. It would mean swallowing his pride and acknowledging that a man he had tried to destroy was actually everything he should have wanted in a son-in-law. Most importantly, it would mean earning back the trust and love of a daughter who had shown more courage and wisdom than he had ever possessed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Robert's road to recovery was long, both physically and emotionally. As his body healed from the massive heart attack, his mind grappled with the reality of how wrong he had been about David, about Grace, and about himself. The first step came 3 weeks after his surgery, when Robert was finally strong enough to leave the hospital. David had overseen his care throughout the recovery, adjusting medications and monitoring his progress with the same attention he gave all his patients. On the day of Robert's discharge, the two men found themselves alone in the hospital room as Helen and Grace handled paperwork at the nurses' station. "David," Robert said, his voice still weak but determined, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life, and I spent months trying to destroy yours. I don't know how to make that right." David finished packing Robert's medications into a bag, then turned to face him directly. "You make it right by being the father Grace deserves. She loves you, Mr. Whitmore, but she's been heartbroken by your rejection of our relationship. If you really want to make amends, start there. Will you help me? I don't know how to fix what I've broken." David studied Robert's face, seeing genuine remorse and determination. "I'll help you, but only if you're truly committed to change. Grace has been hurt enough." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Robert admitted to the specific actions he had taken to damage David's reputation, the calls he had made, the pressure he had applied. David listened without anger, though Robert could see the pain these revelations caused. "I need to know," David said finally. "If I had been white, would you have welcomed me into your family?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Robert wanted to deflect, to find a more comfortable answer, but he forced himself to face the truth. "Yes, if you had been white with the same education, the same career, the same character, I would have been proud to call you my son-in-law from the beginning." Then we both know what this is really about. The question now is whether you're ready to examine why race matters more to you than character. Over the following weeks, Robert began that difficult examination. He started reading books Helen brought him about racial history and contemporary issues. He had conversations with his wife about her own journey toward understanding, realizing that she had been challenging her own assumptions while he had remained stubbornly closed-minded. The breakthrough came when Robert decided to take David up on his offer to help repair their relationship. David invited Robert to observe him at work, to see firsthand what his days were like. With his doctor's permission, Robert spent a morning at the hospital, watching David interact with patients and colleagues. He saw David comfort a frightened child before surgery, explaining the procedure in terms that made the boy laugh instead of cry. He watched David spend extra time with an elderly woman whose family couldn't visit, holding her hand and listening to her stories. He observed David teaching residents, sharing his knowledge with patience and encouragement. Most powerfully, Robert watched David save another life. A middle-aged construction worker had been brought in with chest pain, and David diagnosed a heart condition that required immediate surgery. Robert observed from the gallery as David worked with precision and skill, knowing that he was watching the same hands that had saved his own life. After the surgery, Robert met the construction worker's wife, a woman named Betty who reminded him of his own grandmother. She hugged David with tears in her eyes, thanking him for saving her husband of 35 years. "Dr. Thompson is a gift from God," she told Robert. "I don't know what we would have done without him." Standing in that hospital hallway, Robert finally understood what he had almost thrown away through his prejudice. David wasn't just a good man who happened to be black. He was an exceptional human being whose race was completely irrelevant to his worth as a person and as a potential family member. The next step was harder, making public amends for his actions. Robert requested a meeting with Dr. Williams and the hospital board, where he formally apologized for his attempts to interfere with David's career. The apology was awkward and humbling, but necessary. "I allowed personal prejudices to cloud my judgment about one of your finest doctors," Robert told the assembled board members. "Dr. Thompson saved my life, and I owe him more than I can ever repay. I also owe all of you an apology for attempting to use my position to influence your medical decisions inappropriately." Dr. Williams accepted his apology graciously, though she made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated from any donor or board member in the future, but she also saw an opportunity for positive change. "Mr. Whitmore, if you're serious about making amends, we could use your help with a project Dr. Thompson has been championing. He wants to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing medical careers. Perhaps you'd be interested in contributing." Robert didn't hesitate. "I'd like to fund it entirely, and I want it named in Dr. Thompson's honor. It's the least I can do." The David Thompson Medical Scholarship became Robert's first act of real redemption. But more important changes were happening in his personal life. Grace began visiting her father regularly, bringing David with her as Robert's recovery progressed. The conversations were stilted at first, but gradually became more natural as Robert made genuine efforts to get to know the man his daughter loved. Robert learned about David's childhood, growing up in a working-class family where education was valued above everything else. He heard about David's struggles in medical school, working multiple jobs to pay for his education. He discovered David's passion for research, his dream of developing new surgical techniques that could save more lives. More importantly, Robert saw how David treated Grace. He watched David listen to her ideas about work with genuine interest, support her dreams of starting her own marketing firm, and make her laugh with silly jokes that reminded Robert of his own courtship of Helen decades earlier. The proposal happened 6 months after Robert's heart attack. David asked for Robert's blessing before proposing to Grace, a gesture that moved Robert to tears. "I love your daughter more than anything in this world," David said as they sat in Robert's study. "I want to spend my life making her happy. I know I don't need your permission, but I'd like your blessing." Robert stood and embraced David, surprising them both. "You have my blessing, my gratitude, and my love. Welcome to our family." The wedding was everything Grace had dreamed of. Robert walked her down the aisle with pride, looking out at a congregation that included David's family, hospital colleagues from all backgrounds, and friends who had watched this unlikely journey toward redemption. In his speech at the reception, Robert spoke honestly about his mistakes and his growth. "I almost lost the best thing that ever happened to our family because I couldn't see past my own prejudices," he told the gathered guests. "David didn't just save my life in that operating room. He saved my soul by showing me what real character looks like. He taught me that the content of someone's character matters infinitely more than the color of their skin." The speech received a standing ovation, but the moment that mattered most to Robert was seeing Grace's tears of joy and David's smile of genuine forgiveness. Years later, Robert would become a different man entirely. He used his wealth and influence to support causes that promoted equality and understanding. He became a regular volunteer at the free clinic where David donated his time. He spoke to business groups about the dangers of unconscious bias and the importance of judging people by their actions, rather than their appearance. When Grace and David's first child was born, a beautiful daughter they named Hope, Robert held his granddaughter with wonder and complete love. Looking down at her tiny face, he couldn't imagine ever caring about anything except her health and happiness. "She's perfect," he whispered to David, who stood beside him with Grace resting peacefully nearby. "She is," David agreed, "and she's going to grow up in a family that loves her unconditionally." Robert nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of those words. Hope would never experience the conditional love he had offered Grace, love that came with restrictions and requirements. She would know only the pure, accepting love that he had learned from the man who had saved his life in every possible way. The journey from prejudice to redemption had been painful and humbling, but it had given Robert something more valuable than all his wealth: a family united by love rather than divided by ignorance, and a legacy of character rather than mere success. In saving Robert's heart, David had also saved his soul, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources.